Okay, everyone, I think we will get started and others can keep joining us as they pop in. I'm Barbara Dennison. I want to welcome you to this virtual illustrated talk sponsored by the Friends of Fort Hunter. And we're delighted this evening to bring you a talk on the One Room Schoolhouse in American Society with William Murray. And William Murray is, he says, a retired educator. I don't think you can retire from necessarily educating, but he is retired from the Mechanicsburg Area School District, social studies, history, AP history, gifted in education, and probably other things that I don't know about, but that's a range. And currently is archivist with the Wildcat Foundation or the alumni or some aspect of Mechanicsburg that I think I'm in the ballpark at least, right? And
Absolutely.
he will be talking about his interview-based information with students that attended one-room schoolhouses, also information from newspaper articles, school board reports, and so forth from the era of one-room schoolhouses. As we move forward, anyone who has any questions to be answered, we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. Please put those in the chat function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask those at the end as time permits. I also want to remind everybody that you can go to forthunter.org, and that is also in chat for people to see, to find out about other events at Fort Hunter and our next two virtual talks on October 6th. Rodney Ross will be talking about Harrisburg and World War II. And on November 3rd, Ben Myers will be talking about the common Civil War soldier. So those are both, like this talk, free, but you register to attend. And you can find out more information at forthunter.org. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Murray.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennison. I appreciate it. Appreciate having the opportunity to share some of the research that I have. Is there a way to take this screen down so my PowerPoint will come up?
You need to share your screen now.
All right, and my PowerPoint is not up. Galley view?
You need to share your screen again. You need to hit the thing at the bottom that says share your screen. There.
Okay, and slideshow from the beginning. There we go. Hopefully this will go through without too many glitches. Dr. Dennison and the Friends of Fort Hunter, thank you very much for asking me to come and speak tonight about the research which I've been working on the one-room schools in American society. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I am not from central Pennsylvania, born and raised in Philadelphia, but I was teaching at Mechanicsburg High School, and the principal and the chair of the social studies department at that time came to me. They're both graduates of the school, and they said, we've been collecting this stuff. We have this box of stuff, and we don't know what to do with it. And they said, do you have any students that might get it organized for us? Well, I did, and two students spent quite a bit of time getting the archives really beginning and developing the database, which I still use today. Something very unfortunate happened, though, and that's that those two graduated. I didn't. I maintained then the archives after they left, and at the same point, after I went to retire, they said, you know, we really don't have anybody else that can handle this. Would you mind keeping it on as a volunteer? And I did. I said yes to that, even though I took another job for 6 years. But have maintained the archives and really have fallen in love with the work I'm doing. When you're a historian, it doesn't matter what you're studying, only that you get to study and go very deep into something. So that's why I'm here doing this. Well, now it's time to actually start the class, so let's call you all to attention. If we're going to talk about one-room schools, we really have to put it into context. And the context really begins in 1834. And that's when the state legislature of Pennsylvania passed a law called the Free School Act. They realized, after a lot of wrangling, and it wasn't a very popular act, that you might be told, it cost money, and so there were a lot of people who were opposed to it. Plus, they felt it was going to homogenize the country, and they were afraid of too much democracy. The only people that were able to be educated prior to that were the rich. And what happened in the 1830s, we find that only a small percentage of people can read and write. And businessmen began to realize that we can't advance as a society unless we have people who are literate. And so they championed and had passed the passage of the Free School Act in 1834. What the bill said was that all legal entities needed to appoint a school board, and that would determine how children would receive the education that they would receive. It did not say that the school board had to start a school, but that's what most of them did. They could have paid tuition to send them someplace else, but most started their own school because they were their own school district. As an example, and I use Mechanicsburg a lot during this because that's where I started my research. Mechanicsburg does not start as a school district until 1964. Now you'll notice it says Mechanicsburg Area School District. The Mechanicsburg School District started at the very beginning in 1835. If the word area is there, it means it did join together more than one school district. Mechanicsburg was joined by three separate: the borough of Mechanicsburg, the borough of Shepherdstown, and the township of Upper Allen. Now, if you look at this map, you can see very clearly that two of them were fairly small, and they could have a consolidated school, meaning you could put a building in the middle of Mechanicsburg or the middle of Shepherdstown, and the students could walk fairly easily to the school and then go home. That would have been much more difficult in Upper Allen. What Upper Allen decided to do, and what all districts really in Pennsylvania decided to do, was to take and divide the township into areas. And each area would have its own school. This is a map from 1872 from the Atlas, and I took and superimposed on the word school the little gold stars so you could see where the schools are located. If you take the time to count, there are 9 schools, and that's how many were in the beginning. Here are the 9 schools, and my reason for listing them is not because you care about these or the names, but I think it's interesting to note that if you went out today, 7 of those schools still exist. There's still structures. There's still something that you can physically see and touch. 2 of them, Mount Allen and Shepherdstown, have been torn down. I know Shepherdstown was in bad condition by 1953. I'm told there was a fire at Mount Allen, but I haven't confirmed that. If you look at the 7 that are still there, most of them are homes or have been incorporated into a private home. One of them was purchased by the Oddfellows, and they use it as their meeting site. One of them is an insurance agency. One of them was purchased by a theater company. If you come to Mechanicsburg and go to Little Theater Mechanicsburg, you are actually sitting in a one-room schoolhouse. Most students in the beginning needed to walk to school. And I had a lot of comments that the students made. I thought these were some of the better ones. One told me that her mother was very much frightened of the truckers stopping and abducting her. And so she's told the daughter, if any trucker stops and wants to talk to you, run into the woods or run into the fields. She said in the 8 years she did it, nobody ever stopped to talk to her, but at least she knew what to do if somebody had. Another student was told she needed to walk through the fields. Well, that wasn't a problem during the spring and the fall, but during the winter months, if the snow was high, she said by the time she got to school, she was frozen. and used to spend the first hour in front of the stove. Another told me that when the snows really came down, they still had school. They had to walk along the railroad tracks. Now, the railroad tracks were always clear. And fortunately, the railroad went right up very close to the school, so they didn't have much of a trek after that. The only problem came when the railroad would come barreling down, and they knew at that point they needed to go up the siding so that they could be out of the way, and then they could get back down and make their way to school again. Another student told me that he and a group of his friends would walk to school in the area of the quarry. And more than a couple times, the quarry people who knew they were doing this would stop them and say, you need to wait for a little while, we're going to be blasting. They were late for school, but that's okay. The teacher knew that they were going to be late because, well, he could hear the blasting too. Here's a graphic I found which shows what we've all been saying, that if you're walking to school, it's 20 miles and you have to walk uphill both ways, both from your home to get to school and get past all the snow, which is there even in the fall and the spring, and get past the killer mountain goat. Now, I did ask the people I interviewed about the killer mountain goat. For some reason, nobody seemed to remember that. I'm not sure why. I know it's true because, well, I found this slide on the internet. By the way, this says 20 miles. And I'm told I'm told it's a law, but I've never found it. So I'm going to say an agreement that schools needed to be no more than 3 miles apart, so that if you lived in the middle, you only had 1.5 miles to walk to get to school. By the way, they tried to put the schools where the students already were, rather than exactly the geographic center of the areas. A lot of kids didn't have to walk more than a quarter mile. This is a monthly report, 2 of them that I found that I'm going to share with you because they tell us some things. One is for Pleasant Grove, which was a school in the area. By the way, if it says LL or AH or JC, that tells me that it's a male. If you'll notice, in Pleasant Grove from 1881 to 1889, Frances Stoop was the only female that taught there. Also, I find it interesting that they change teachers every year. If I go down to Center Square, it starts out heavily with males, but by the end, there are a number of females that are teaching. Notice, by the way, Flora E. Schwartz, who was replaced by Flora E. Rupp, who, by the way, has exactly the same handwriting. So what that tells me is that Flora Schwartz gets married and then has to stop teaching in the middle of the year because married women are not able to teach. I have no clue why that's true, but that was the rule in those days. I have Jesse Asper highlighted up here. I'm going to be coming back and mentioning his name a little bit later. Was able to read quite a bit of the board minutes of the Upper Allen School District, because I have all of them actually sitting in my office. There were 9 schools. They operated for 6 months out of the year. When the weather got nice, the kids were needed on the farm, so the teacher had to do whatever he or she could do in 6 months. I found out that the Allendale School, one of the schools, was going to be visited by the entire board. They needed to go and make a decision. Do we tear the building down? It's in pretty bad shape, or can we repair it? Well, a later board minute said that they did what most school boards would want to do. They repaired it rather than spending the money to rebuild it. They also said that the teachers would be paid $35 a month. By the way, a little interesting tidbit for that. If you wanted to get paid, you had to take your board report. You had to take your teaching report, with the grades and your lesson plans, and they had to be reviewed at the board meeting, and you would get paid at that point. And then in the report, it would be listed that you were paid. So they actually would sign off for it. You would get a chit that way. If you, by the way, missed a month because you were ill or had something else and couldn't be at the board meeting, you just didn't get paid until the next month. So instead of getting $35, you'd get double that amount the next month. I did read of one who missed 2 and got all of the money in the third. So they had to live on whatever they had until the board met again. Here's the 1878 for Upper Allen, and again, you will notice Miss Katie Brandt and Miss Lydia Kroll, the only females that are teaching. Everybody talks about the school mom, but when it comes right down to it, these are almost all men that are teaching at this point. School was run by a school board. The school board, like today, is elected. Here's an article I found for Upper Allen, and I thought it was interesting. G. Weir Strock, he went by Weir, was the school board president. And then I noticed down here that the vice president was Claire. And I was so impressed with Upper Allen at that point for doing that, until I did a little more research and found out that Claire was married to Mary. They had 3 children. He was a fairly prominent farmer. So much for a female being a vice president. Now, as you can see, the school board in those days did more than a school board today. They actually hire the teachers, they fire the teachers. Now, a school board today technically still does both of those things. They hire and they accept a resignation or a firing. But there's some layers. It's actually the district office which does most of that, the hiring and the firing, and that's approved by the school board. But you're not really a member of the school community until the school board says yes. They actually went out and observed the teachers and the students in action. Up until about 1860, excuse me, there wasn't anybody that would go out and do that except the school board members. So they were responsible at least every couple of months to go out and make sure everything was okay in the school and the students were learning. They were in charge, as we've alluded to earlier with the Allendale comments, on the maintenance of the school. No person who was responsible from the maintenance department to come out and do that. They did it themselves. The school teacher and his students, or her students, would take care of the day-to-day things, the cleaning, the emptying of the trash cans, etc. But it was really the school board who came in and did most of that. And of course, just like today, they make policy, they set the budget, they pay the bills, all the things we would expect a modern school board to be involved in. Here's an auditor's report to talk about how money is spent. Now, I realize you can't read this. I'm going to blow up part of it for you so you can see. What I'd like you to take notice of is that the entire school budget for the year was under $5,000. That's how much came in and how much had to go out. The largest figures was the state appropriations and the local taxes. So that made up the bulk of it. But you'll notice what a large percentage the state appropriation was at that point, certainly a lot larger than today. I don't know if you're familiar with school budgets or not, but the local school budget does not receive anywhere near 50%. Teacher salary made up the largest amount. And by the way, that is true today if you look at a school budget. But they also had to pay for other things, fuel and hauling. They had to have coal generally delivered. Most of them were heated by coal. It could have been wood, but most of them were coal. They did have somebody who came in once a year and cleaned the houses. The 9 of them could be cleaned for less than $30. That was a deep cleaning, if you will. They came in and spent the day doing that. Teacher preparation was $90. They had an institute once a year. And by the way, that was voluntary for the students to go to, for the teachers to go to, but the students wanted them to go because if the teacher didn't go, then they had class between Christmas and New Year's. Otherwise, the students had that time off while the teachers were at the institute. Most of them did go, and that was $90. The one here that really gets me is $7.36 for the superintendent's convention. They didn't have a superintendent, so I'm not quite sure what that money was spent on. All wasn't rosy for the school boards. I have 2 examples here of Tramps, here's one of a group of tramps busting into one of the schools and really doing quite a bit of damage to the building. And it said this is the 4th time during the present session that this has occurred. And it basically, the press takes the school board to task and says, you need to do a better job of making the school secure. Schools at this point probably didn't even have locks on. Here's another from 1917. Again, this is Upper Allen, and it talks about the fact that thieves broke in and made a big mess, but also carried away the entire supply of coal. This is December, which meant that when the kids went in the next day, it was pretty cold in that building until they could get coal. By about 1860, and I don't have an exact date for that, but it's 1860 is what I keep reading. There was something which was called the Office of County Superintendent. Now, this would not have applied to Harrisburg or would not have applied to Carlisle or Chambersburg, Lebanon. The larger cities had their own superintendents. They were large enough. But the smaller school districts did not. And so they used the Office of the County Superintendent as their district office. And the county superintendent was to be in every classroom every year and observe the teachers. That took some of the load off the school board. And it was the county superintendent that would make recommendations for improvement. And by the way, I do have one letter in the file. The county superintendent sent the letter to the teacher and basically said, you need to do a better job of disciplining your students. Otherwise, I will be going to your school board and telling them my recommendation is that you not be rehired. So they had a lot of influence, and certainly if the county superintendent said something, the school board would listen to it. Teacher, by the way, was rehired and then went on to have a very successful career, so I guess he got much better. They would run, the county superintendent would run the Teacher Institute and would evaluate students. Now, not on a day-to-day basis, but at the end of 8th grade to see if indeed the students from the one-room schoolhouse could graduate and go on to high school. Upper Allen didn't even have a principal until 1915 when George Berkheimer was elected as the first principal. Prior to that point, most schools worked very independently. When it comes right down to it, the teacher, and here's the teacher over here, Mr. Wentz, notice by the way how well he's dressed. That is not uncommon. Even in the rural schools, they dressed the tilt in dark suits, the men did. But again, take a look at the students. Now these look like they could very well be junior high students, but look at these kids. And this teacher was responsible for all 8 grades. Education wasn't compulsory. It certainly wasn't compulsory at the end of grade 8. You had a choice. You could get a job. You could go to the high school. And some of them did make that decision to drop out and get a job. As time went on, more and more kids would advance on and go to high school because it was felt that a high school degree was valuable to them. But in the very beginning, they didn't see it that way. Before they could attend high school, as I said, they had to pass a test. The test was administered by the Office of County Superintendent or designate. And in this case, here's the test that's given on a Saturday. If you want to go to high school, you show up and you take the test, and we'll make a decision as to whether or not you've learned enough that you can go on. It was proctored by 2 individuals, A.A. Arnold and A.A. Landis. Remember the Landis name I mentioned earlier. He had taught one of the one schoolhouses. He's now a principal of one of the schools. You would receive a letter like this if you were a student and you passed the test. And the test basically said that you had the school district's permission to move, the county superintendent's permission to move on and go, in this case, to the Mechanicsburg Secondary School. If you didn't have this letter, and I don't think you can see it, but there is a raised seal down here. If you didn't have that letter with the raised seal, well, this was your ticket to get in the first day. If you didn't have it, you just couldn't go. So this was very prized for kids. Sort of like a letter from a college today, if you will, saying that you made it in. I want to talk for a few minutes about school construction. You'll notice that many of the schools look very much alike. Here's one of the schools that I studied specifically, but you'll notice that there is a very steep roof. Schools at that point all had the bell and a bell tower. You had a chimney because they were all stove. Generally a door in the middle, and in this case there were 3. Sometimes there were 4 windows, depending on how large it is. And you can sort of see peeking out of the side here, you can see the beginning of another little structure. There are actually 2 of them. And this one also came equipped with what I'm going to refer to as the Clarabelle car. That's because the teacher's name was Clarabelle Brubaker. Here's the same building. Again, you can see one of the things I want you to notice in this, you can see the outhouses are clearly here. One of the things I want you to notice here is that there's very little structure underneath it. They did not have a basement to speak of. There was a small basement, but even the little kids couldn't stand up. You almost had to crawl. I also want you to notice that this particular structure is facing up the hill. Here is the same building, but it's been modified. If you walked into it today, it's a modern looking office. It doesn't look like a one-room schoolhouse at all. But again, you can see the features, and if you drove past this, you would say to yourself, that looks like a one-room schoolhouse, and you'd be correct. Notice, by the way, the structure underneath it. When they turned the building, they put it on a basement, which hadn't been there before. If you go down there, it's a boardroom, and there's another room for storage. But again, it's the same basic outside structure, so they stayed with that. The person who owns it today was very, very adamant about wanting to keep the integrity of the building, even to keep the chalk dust on the outside of the building. When the kids would go out to clean the erasers, they would bang them up against the building, and you can still see it. Part of the charm of the building. Anyway, the reason they're so much alike is because there was a manual that was printed in 1885 that went out to all school boards. They received this for free. And it was a manual on how to go about constructing schools. It did not only deal with schools in the rural setting, it also dealt with city schools and the rest of it. But it was put out under the Secretary of Common Schools, which would be Secretary of Education today. And it did talk about a whole lot of things, not just constructing the building, but how to locate it, ventilate it, furnish it, etc. I don't want to let you think that all schools look exactly like the ones I talked about. Here's one in Chester County. You'll notice the vestibule is a little different than the porch overhang, which I had shown you. This has 4 windows in it. You'll notice the chimney. The one I showed you was in the back. This is along the side, the middle. Here's the Murray School, which, by the way, no relationship to me, but I had to put it in. One of my students sent this to me, and I needed to make sure it was highlighted. Again, you'll notice 2 doors here, a little bit more of a basement here. There's 4 windows on the side. You have the overhang rather than the full porch. And again, if you look to the side here, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but this is on the campus of Shepherdstown University. This is called the Potato Point School. Again, 4 windows, and you can see there's a little variation, but very similar. In this one, the stove was in the back. Here's one that they're rebuilding right now, or renovating, I should say. And they want to turn this into a model school so that they can showcase what one-room schools and rural schools were like. And again, you'll notice this one was built a little later because the original building burned down. Interesting story behind that. The teacher on her first day of school wasn't given very good directions on how to light the fire, and she tried that and burned the school down. She was interviewed years later after a very successful career, by the way, and said that every day after her first day was much, much better. Here's a one-room schoolhouse. It's actually a two-room schoolhouse. If you had more population in a rural area, sometimes they would put a second floor on it. I'm not quite sure what's in the back here. I'm going to track that down. Somebody just gave me this one. This is the outlet school in Schuylkill County. And of course, there's always one that blows you away. This is probably the oldest of the buildings. Some of the original schools that were built were actually octagonal. And here's one, the octagonal school from Chester County. If you go into the into the interior of a school, you probably wouldn't see a whole lot of things that are different than a modern school today, or any other school, I should say. Students, here's one student who's leading the discussion, I suppose. She's reading. Most of the students with rapt attention. You'll notice this one here who is just fixated on the camera, but there's always that one student. And I have no clue what these two are doing. But they're doing it right in front of the teacher, so I guess it's okay. They're probably cooperating somehow. Anyway, this is the Clarabelle that I mentioned of Clarabelle School. So Clarabelle Brubaker, through most of her career, she later married Clarabelle Brubaker Gutschall. Another interior, this is Mr. Myers. Again, you'll notice the suit. It must be winter, or at least chilly out, because the kids have their coats in the back of the room. And they're sitting at two-person desks, which was very common in those days. Again, to give you an idea what a typical classroom looks like, I wanted to point this out. In about the 1930s, schools became electrified. But they never did have interior plumbing. And so it was up to probably two strong boys every morning had to go to the neighboring farm and have an outdoor pump. And they would take a pail and bring back a pail of water that they would put into this, that would keep the water cool through the day. Talking to and interviewing some of the people, I found out that many of them told me that they had one cup for the entire room. So if you wanted to drink water, that was the cup you used. Some said, oh no, we had our own individual cups we had to bring from home. So it really depended on the teacher and whether or not they understood about germs. Here's another picture, and I just wanted to point out this long rope here. This was the student's favorite instrument. Now, I guess I shouldn't say that. It's probably their least favorite instrument, because this would call them in from recess and call them in at the beginning of the day. This would ring the bell. There was a stove. The stove could be in front of the room and back of the room. In this case, in the middle of the room. Generally, by the end, heated by coal, but some of them were heated by wood. Some of the people that I interviewed couldn't remember, but I think most of the things I read said that by the 1930s, 40s, 50s, they were heated by coal. That meant, by the way, one of two things. Either the principal or the teacher needed to be there an hour early to make sure, if it was a cold, chilly day, that the coal stove was working and that the kids wouldn't freeze when they came in. Or in one case, what the teacher did, because he came from about 5 miles away and had to walk, he asked one of the students if he would go in every morning and start the stove. And so generally they banked it so that it was fairly easy to start in the morning. You just had to put more coal in. But on Monday mornings, it took a little bit more. You actually had to use kindling to get it started. But that way, when everybody got there, it would be more. What the student told me was that he would go and do it. He lived a couple houses away. He would go and do it, start it, and then would leave and would go home and have breakfast. The mother would have his breakfast prepared. So he did his good deed for the day. Probably got him a few extra points. I'll blame him for that. You notice the library here. There was no school library covering multiple grades. It was just the one grade. The stove over here. And I also want to point out the bench. I'm going to come back to that in a few seconds. Here's the bench. The reason that bench is there is because of the age range of students. When I first looked at this picture, I thought, okay, there's the teacher. No, here's the teacher. This is Mr. Hutchinson. Again, they're both fairly well dressed, and they both look fairly old, but this must be an 8th grade student. Well, maybe he isn't. Maybe he's a little older, but chose not to go to high school. I've heard of examples of students like that that repeat 8th grade multiple years simply because it's too far to get to the high school, to take too much time, and it may be on the farm. But anyway, at the same point you look, you can see some of these kids certainly look like they could be 8th graders, whereas some of these significantly younger. You can almost go through and say, all right, 1st grade, 2nd grade, maybe 3rd grade. The teacher had to be very well organized. Always an opening exercise. Now today in elementary classrooms, you frequently have a class meeting at the beginning of the day to do group things and then break them apart. That's exactly how the One Room Schoolhouse was structured. You would bring them together for a pledge to the flag, maybe a prayer, maybe a reading, maybe a song, really depended on the teacher. The teacher would then begin to work with an individual class. So let's suppose that it's early on a Monday morning, you're going to bring up the 1st graders and you're going to work with them in math. The 1st graders would sit at that bench and you would be teaching a lesson to the 1st graders. The first thing you would do would be to review what you did the day before. The students all left you with an assignment. You would go over that assignment to make sure that they understood what had to be done or what the last lesson was. Then, once the teacher was satisfied, the teacher would then deliver a new lesson, new material. After that was done, the teacher would give the students an assignment and send them back to their desks. And they were to work on that assignment. Very rarely did students take homework home. They usually had enough time within the day to get their assignments done. By the way, they were told not to approach the teacher if they had any questions until they had talked to at least 2 or 3 students. By the way, they didn't have to be students in their class. It could be students the grade older than them who had already had the material and hopefully would know it. That way they were cooperating and again teaching each other. If they couldn't get satisfied that way, they were certainly in between classes. They could approach the teacher and ask a question. Teacher would deal with grade 1 and then grade 2, then grade 3, and so on throughout the day. About halfway through the morning, there was a recess. They'd bring them back, then grades 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, it didn't always work out nice and neatly like that, but you get the idea. Lunch was an hour long. Recess was 15 minutes. There was a recess in the morning. There was a recess in the afternoon. If they worked on math in the morning, they might work on English in the afternoon. Classes started at 9 in the morning, hour for lunch, ended at 4 in the afternoon so that the kids could be home in winter, hopefully before dark. Again, here's another classroom, and you can see the benches being used here by the teacher. This is fairly typical. Not all classrooms had it, but you had to have a spot here so that the students could come in front. You'll notice that all the other students in the classroom are reading. Except for this kid, I have no clue what he's doing. But I notice the teacher is looking in that direction, so I feel comfortable that it will be taken care of. Here's some report cards from the period, and I picked only 2nd or 3rd grade report cards so you can get a feel as to what the kids were learning. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, but you'll notice that in 3rd grade in 1878, that there was emphasis on reading, grammar, spelling, arithmetic, penmanship, and history. And this 3rd grader would receive a grade on all of those things. He did very well in all of them, 1s or 2s. Those down here, Mr. Gogenauer, and remember I had mentioned his name earlier. he was, 1 was very good and 2 was good. So just like an ABC today that we would have. Again, this is 1900, and you can see the sort of things that they would have been learning. One thing I want to impress with you, and this is not a 7th grader, but on the report card is algebra. That meant that by the time a student was in 8th grade, they'd spent a year in algebra. I didn't get that until 9th grade, but that's all right. Here's a report card from about 1936. And again, you can take a look here, and it's very, very similar. Now, I don't know whether by high school they had arithmetic, whether the arithmetic was algebra or not. Could very well have been. Social studies was added here. The teacher taught that the second half of the year. Evidently spent a lot of time on poetry, because that was a separate line item here, as well as music and drawing that the students in this district had. By the way, did you ever notice that when report cards survive, they're all A's and B's? How come those are the only ones that survive? Here's one from 1949, and again, the same sort of thing for a student in 2nd or this is 3rd grade. And here's a 2nd grade report card, and again, the same thing. So kids had a fairly comprehensive education, and I asked the students that I interviewed, the former students of the One Room Schoolhouse, did they feel that when they got to high school that they were as prepared as the students who had gone through the regular schooling? And they said that, you know, in a lot of ways we were better prepared, because if we were going to go on to high school and had been in that One Room Schoolhouse for 8 years, we heard the same lesson over and over and over again. If you were in 4th grade, as an example, not only did you hear the 4th grade lesson, but the room was fairly small. You could hear what the teacher was doing. And so you were reviewing grades 1, 2, and 3, as well as 4, and you were anticipating 5, 6, 7, and 8. So by the time you got to 8th grade, you'd already heard the lesson 7 times prior to that. It didn't become, it wasn't as difficult for them. Not everything, of course, happened in the classroom. Here is a spelling bee that one of the teachers organized. All are welcome. It was held in the evening, and parents were, well, anybody from the community for that matter, was welcome to come. It was 1913. There wasn't as much on television in those days. And so people were always looking to be entertained. Actually, 1913 is even a little early for radio. And so this became an entertainment, an outlet for people, as well as for the students. Another article talks about an educational meeting that was held just to let people know what was happening, but that was also filled with recitations and readings, so spelling, arithmetic, and other branches, so that you could see what your student was doing and whether or not they were properly learning. By the way, there was a speaker that night. Hopefully he didn't go on too long, because he was the tax collector. That was Jesse Asper. He was the county tax person. Here's a field day, but not only do they have things like an apple race, a peanut scramble, a ball throw, the things I would think about today with a field day. They also had some academic things in the morning, like declamation, arithmetic, spelling, and professor quiz. I have no clue what that is. I have not been able to find it, but it's 1939. It's a little early for Jeopardy. Maybe it's a precursor to some of the early quiz shows. And of course, not everything was academic. I'm not quite sure what they're doing here, whether they're giving a concert or whether they're just demonstrating something. But either way, they're in front of the class in costume, demonstrating. For what it's worth, for those of you, if anybody is online from Mechanicsburg, this fellow goes on to teach at Mechanicsburg High School, and is a member of a band that would do things for school assemblies as well as for outside. A group called the South Mountain Ramblers. Mrs. Don Whitman. And of course, even the first graders had to get up and do some sort of a presentation. I'm not quite sure what they're doing or what they're talking about, but I do know that this kid is dressed to kill and probably will not become a banker. Not only did they do things that were academic, the One Room School felt that they needed to make the students part of the greater community. And here we have an example of collecting money for the March of Dimes. This is 1947, and if you remember, polio was really big at that point. And so they're trying to collect money to become part of the community. I like this. Not only does it give me the names of the teachers, the amount that they collected from each class, but it also tells me where they live. So I know that Clara Brubaker lived in downtown Mechanicsburg, and that's why she needed a car in order to get out to the One Room Schoolhouse. Well, you can't talk about schools unless you talk about discipline. And of course, when you're talking about discipline, every room had a paddle. And every student told me that the teachers would use them if necessary. Nobody seemed to feel that they had been, or that the teacher had done anything really inappropriate. That most of the teachers used it when they needed to, but only as a last resort. Now I suppose there's always that teacher that goes a little too far. But that's what the hickory stick was for, I suppose. Can't talk about school unless you mention recess and lunch. As I said, they had 15 minutes in the morning, an hour for lunch, and 15 minutes. Some of the kids could walk home. It really depended on how close you were. But most of them were too far away and they needed to stay. And they could go wherever they wanted. They could go into the woods, they could go. They had their favorite rocks, some groups had, they would go and sit at. They would spend time playing when they were out there. I think every group that told me that I talked to said that they played baseball. That seemed to be the universal. Everybody mentioned that. Not only the guys, by the way, but also the girls that would play baseball. Schools weren't all that big. You needed, if you were going to have 11. They didn't always have a regulation bat. Some of them just had literally pieces of wood that they would use as a bat. You had one ball that had to last you because if you lost the ball, that was it. You couldn't throw it into the stands like they do in the majors because if you did, you wouldn't have a ball for the next inning. Or you would, if it started to come apart, they would tape it together. I don't know if as a kid you'd had to do that, but I remember doing that. Growing up in the city, we had to tape our balls together. What I really liked was the story that one student told me about third base. Well, first base was the post over there. Second base was the bush out in the front. And third base was across the highway, or at least across the country road, and the tree. Can you imagine today? Now, again, this is a country road. There wasn't nearly the traffic that they would have even today on the country road. But saying to kids, we're going to be playing in the street. Anyway, they got away with it. As far as I know, nobody was ever hurt. At least I didn't read anything about any students having any problems. They had the time. They could go fishing. Sometimes the teacher liked to fish, so he would take the kids out, and they would spend an hour lunch break fishing. They could always play tag. They could play marbles. One kid said he liked to go and play on the railroad tracks. So he said, but he could only do that if the teacher was inside. So if the teacher came out, he couldn't do that. A lot of them told me about a game called Tidely High Over. And I did research and could not find anything under that name. I did find similar games. The game was played by dividing the school into two. You had an A and a B team. You put the A team on one side of the school and the B team on the other, and the A team would throw the ball over the school, and it was up to somebody on the B team to catch it. If it was caught, that person could run around to the A team and throw it at somebody, and if they hit them, that person was then caught and had to come over to the B side. That game was played until one of two things happened. Everybody was on one side, or lunch was over. Well, like Monopoly, you know, could you play this forever? But the game generally ended whenever the bell rang. The kids had. By about 1930, actually a little earlier than that, we begin to see things changing. This is a photo I just stole from the Museum Association here in Mechanicsburg. It shows paving that was happening on a road near a one-room schoolhouse. So what a perfect picture for this particular shot. Anyway, they began to pave roads, and you begin to see the beginning of school buses. And so it became possible that that child who might have had to walk 10 miles to get to school before could just walk to a bus stop and pick up the bus. By about the 1920s, they begin to talk about school consolidation. They're still talking about it in the 1930s. Some schools did consolidate that early in the 1920s. Others waited until the 1930s or 40s or even later. You'll notice the comment that's here. This change could not have easily been made in the days of dirt roads, but with all-weather highways and school buses, the Unified Township School is far superior to the old order, and only the most virulent lost-back finds fault with the change. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I sure wouldn't want to be on that side of the argument. Anyway, what we have happening then is we have people by the 1920s, 1930s really begin to talk about school consolidation. Now, it doesn't come to Mechanicsburg and Upper Allen until the 1950s with the opening of the Upper Allen Consolidated School. The school is still in existence today. It's still used as an elementary school. It's called the Shepherdstown Elementary School now, and I'm not going to go into why the name change. What happened is on Friday, the kids went to their regular one-room schoolhouse. On Monday, they reported to the new Upper Allen Consolidated School. Now, what some of them had to do is to go back to the one-room schoolhouse because that's where the bus picked them up. But they were then bused to this consolidated school. By the way, if you're wondering why this presentation is being made by Bill Murray, it's because we opened our school on Groundhog Day. Here's the faculty. This was the faculty of the one-room schoolhouse. This gentleman taught in the Center Square School. He became the 8th grade teacher. This person, I believe he was the 5th grade teacher, and so on. Now, there are only 7 teachers in 8 grades, so one of them wound up teaching a joint class, either it was 7-8 or 6-7 or 4-5 or something like that. It didn't depend on the grade as much as it did on the number of students that they had. The itinerant teacher, who had been driving from school to school to give music lessons, made the decision, or didn't make the decision, she had the opportunity now to have her own classroom. And so she could have a lot more things available to students. It wasn't just vocal music. She could actually have some instruments and all for them. But these were the students, or these were the teachers in the one-room schoolhouses who then became the original teachers of the consolidated school. Up to this teacher from Graham School, which is Clarabelle Brubaker Gutschall. By the way, I'll mention her one more time. I happen to have a picture of her in the file. She was a student in a one-room school. I have a picture there. The teacher, by the way, was her father, who was also a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. As was, by the way, this one, her sister. Now, what was the impact of the one-room schoolhouse? Well, 3 things I'm going to mention. Number one, it really is the icon. If you think about schools, the picture that often pops up, probably incorrectly today, but is the one-room schoolhouse. I think it was interesting when George W. Bush wanted to introduce No Child Left Behind. One of the things he did was to build in front, or have built in front of the Department of Education, a mock one-room schoolhouse. So in order to get into the department, he had to walk through the one-room schoolhouse. He was trying to make the point that we were getting from the one-room school into the modern era. If you are a retired teacher, you might be a member of the Pennsylvania Association of School Retirees. Well, this is their mailbox. If you go to their office, their state office, which by the way is located about a mile from my house, and they're all pass it all the time. That's what it looks like. Even though I'd be willing to bet there are very few retired one-room teachers, retired one-room schoolhouse teachers that are still teaching. In rural America, it was often the community center, far more than the churches, by the way, because a small community might have 2 or 3 churches, but they had one school. And that school would bring the people together. It wasn't only used as a school, but also as a community center. And also, as they said here, the schoolhouse rose like a boy of learning in a sea of ignorance. A little melodramatic, I suppose, but at least it tells you that people valued the school and what was happening there. It brought a common culture, and it helped to bring the students together and make them part of not only their local community, but also of the United States, because those values were taught in the one-room schoolhouse. The third thing it did was to bring literacy. Prior to, as I said, the 1830s, 1840s, it was very rare that a person could read and write unless they had the money to go to an academy. Now, the average person could read, the average person could write. In interviewing many of the people about what they did with their lives, obviously some of them stayed on the farm and became fairly well off as farmers. Some went into factories, some went into to work as independent businessmen. Some of them became shopkeepers, but some of them became doctors, lawyers, school teachers, just what you would expect out of a classroom full of kids. Kids were diversified, and their occupations that they took were diversified, but they all became economically, well, many of them, most of them became economically well off, certainly better off than they would have been otherwise. If you are interested in doing some further reading, a couple of things I want to recommend to you. The first one is a book by Jonathan Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has written what I would consider to be the best work on one-room schools. It's called Small Wonder Little Boys Schoolhouse in District 1. He does an excellent job of tying the one-room school to the advancement of our culture. I'd also like to offer anybody who's interested, I have an article that's published on one-room schoolhouses. Now, it deals specifically with the local area, so it's going to cover basically Cumberland County, but mainly the Mechanicsburg area, because frankly, that's who I work with. And if you're interested in that, there's my email. Feel free, and I'll have this up again a little bit later. Feel free to send me an email and just put One Room Schoolhouse, so I'll know to send you a PDF of the article. Again, Dr. Dennison, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope I have gone quickly enough and fast enough so that I haven't left too many people behind. If any of you are interested in doing any research on educational history, please keep me in mind. Obviously, we have much more in Mechanicsburg than I have in Cumberland County. We have much more in Cumberland County than I have in Pennsylvania. I have more in Pennsylvania than I have in the nation. It sort of works out that way. But we are in a small building all by myself, sitting on the campus, just off the campus of the Kindergarten Academy and right next to the district office. So if anybody is interested, please feel free. And, we'd be happy to work with you on whatever your project is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are delighted to have had you share all of that information with us. And we can just imagine some of those schoolhouses, sitting over in Dauphin County, in the time, certainly that the mansion at Fort Hunter was lived in throughout the 19th and that piece of 20th century. And so, heading up the river, there, I'm sure were other one-room schoolhouses. So you've given us a lot to think about in this central Pennsylvania area. And as you said, across the state and even across One Room Schoolhouse in general. I don't see any questions in chat.
One comment I will make, and I don't think very many of them are in use anymore, but at one time there were 60,000 one-room schoolhouses in the United States. I looked for a figure for Pennsylvania and I couldn't find one. 50,000, most of them in the Midwest. And that would make sense. Little House on the Prairie had to have its neighboring schoolhouse.
In Pennsylvania, it was probably that 500 school districts that we even have today, you know,
Yeah.
times, you know, 9 each or something like that. Yeah, some crazy number, but no, that's a good point about how many there were. I mean, I don't know how many schools there are now in the United States, but given the differential in population size and so forth, that's kind of amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
The One Room Schoolhouses. But, you know, thank you again, everybody who joined us. And you have Bill Murray's email there if you want to ask him some more questions. You can always contact the Friends of Fort Hunter through forthunter.org if you lose that email address and you want to get in touch with him. And this talk will be posted to the Fort Hunter website in a few days once we get all the technology bit done that allows us to do that. And again, we thank you for allowing us to post that. And please don't forget to register for the next upcoming talk on October 6th on Harrisburg's home front in World War II, and the November 3rd talk on the Civil War soldier. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.